OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about The Map is Indestructible, Part 3, Korbowski's Insanity, Gödel's Inconsistency, Barfield's Rainbow, Leibniz, Monads, Zizek's Hegelian Ideology, and Pynchon's Mad Love. We've already talked on Korbowski's work, Science, Insanity, Gödel, Barfield, Leibniz, and today we're going to be focusing on Zizek and Thomas Pynchon. We have talked about how, following the previous thinkers, that reality consists of situation, process, relations. We cannot understand reality with the symbolic or logic of A is A. It can be a very effective tool, but it also can be overfit, leading to various pathologies and problems. And if reality is relational, as we have argued, we cannot escape maps, but the same also holds if reality is ultimately abyssal and or lacking. So, which leads us, of course, to the work of Zizek. So we're considering different ontological, metaphysical models which would make maps inescapable, something that we have to deal with. And a map is not merely a fact. That would be a kind of an important distinction. We can't escape maps into facts or autonomous observation, we might say. We always have to deal with these systems of interconnected, interlocking facts, data. So we simply must always work with maps. And maps aren't the territory. It came up in the net. But another issue is that if a map is too much like the territory, it becomes too complex and becomes useless. But if it isn't enough like the map, then it's also useless. And if the map isn't enough like the territory, it's also useless and causes various problems. Well, if there's also something about reality where there's a Lacanian real, that if we face, we could be overwhelmed or suffer self-effacement, existential anxiety, then this is another reason why we need to deal with a map. And ultimately, an essentially lacking reality could be lacking because it is a territory that consists of map-making, that map-making is part of the territory itself, of which isn't the territory, and so the lack emerges, I suppose you could say like a Mobius strip that folds in back on itself, but it always has this inability to fully get the whole at one time. Zizek likes the idea of the Mobius strip. But if map making is part of the territory and maps are not the territory, then the territory consists of a certain fundamental incompleteness. Now, this is lack is not nothing. So this does not mean the territory is nothing, but it means it is a present absence. And maybe it's absent because it fully saturates what we can conceive, like Thomas Jockin makes the example of looking at the sun, and the light is so excessive that you have to shut your eyes, you can't see it. Or one could think of a truly extraordinary, beautiful experience that transcends the faculties, and thus we lack what we need to experience it. And there also can be a lack in that you never see the fullness of the sun in the same way you never see the fullness of a bookcase. Maybe theoretically you could, if you were omnipresent, omniscient, knew everything, or had advanced enough of a technology. But even if you could, it would change a moment later, a moment later, a moment later. So everything seems to be processing, and thus it seems to be lacking. But lack is always tied to excess. It is always tied to relation. So I don't think Zizek's model necessarily comes in conflict with previous thinkers like Korbowski, Leibniz, etc., so forth. I think all of them are describing situation. And if all of them are describing situation in some form, then the map is indestructible. We are always going to be dealing with map. We cannot destroy them. Now, that doesn't mean a map can't fail us or that we can't leave maps, but that the map is indestructible in the sense that if you actually, if you could destroy it, you'd be overwhelmed and self-effaced like a Lovecraft creature. So, by the map is indestructible, I don't mean to say it's technically indestructible, but that it's practically indestructible. That in practice, we cannot destroy it without destroying ourselves or making reality unintelligible, which then, of course, means that we as subjects have to learn to live with maps and map making as opposed to try to destroy them. Zizek talks about dialectical materialism. This is, his famous idea that you could really look at like less than nothing as a great example of. We'll talk about that in the Absolute Choice. And Cadell Last has tremendous lectures on that. And I've also been thinking a lot on Stuart Kaufman's idea of a fundamental non-locality. which, if true, would make quantum entanglement fundamental, non-locality fundamental, interaction that exceeds the speed of light. And I do wonder if this could be thought together with Žižek, but that would be another matter at another time. There's a lovely book called Conversations with Žižek by Glenn Daly, and Mikey at Theory Underground has noted this book, and it's a really good way to get a grasp on Žižek's thinking. I really like the book. And some of the kind of ideas that came out of that text is reality itself is always constructed as an attempt to establish a basic consistency against the integrative effects of the real, capital R, we're thinking Lacan here. Just as being may be understood as being towards madness, reality is always reality toward the real. Now, this is very odd, though, because if reality actually reaches the real, it's destroyed. It can't handle the real. It's traumatized. And yet, reality is constituted by its very towardness to this trauma and by its very trauma. So there's something very odd here. But I think we can think it as the map isn't the territory. There's a kind of trauma in the map not being the territory, but what makes the map useful and real and itself is a relation to the territory that it is toward. But if it actually equaled, it would be useless. It would be like the Borgia story, where a map becomes as big as the kingdom and crushes the kingdom when it is unraveled. Now, please also note that being toward madness, I think, is something that comes out in the Thomas Pynchon novels like Gravity's Rainbow, The Crying of Lot 49 that Harold Bloom noted. So we will talk about that. It's a being towards a feeling that everything is connected as well, and yet the way it is connected is not something that can ever enter the symbolic or imaginary registers without destroying them. By the real, again, we are thinking Lacan, and so there's a kind of essential, consists essentially of a traumatic real that we cannot naturally face. And so, Žižek tells us while the real, by definition, cannot be directly represented, it can never, nonetheless, be alluded to in certain figurative embodiments of horror excess. It is alluded to in the monster from, Ridley Scott's film Alien, whose blood literally dissolves the fabric of reality. So there's a way in which the real is this kind of thing that dissolves reality, and yet reality exists in relation to the real and toward the real. So we're dealing with an unstable situation, as a piece describes democracy in Thoughts, the first Thoughts. And now, critically, the real should not be identified exclusively as an explicit force of negation. It also plays a more implicit and evanescent role in the construction of our everyday forms of social reality. So the real, again, is not purely a destructive force. It is something... There's a real sense in which perhaps the social would never come into existence without it. If there was not this real that we would try to orbit and to avoid, we may not move at all, per se. There may not be any motion. It's kind of like less than nothing means there's movement. If there's nothing, less than nothing would suggest that there's no movement. There's that idea, Yet It Moves was an original possible title for that book. And so there's this idea that yet it moves. The real has this traumatic effect, and yet it moves us. And yet it seems to have a motion to it, and then it constructs. In that motion, there's a positive construction that arises. Likewise, in the map not being the territory, that doesn't mean the map is nothing. The map actually is something precisely because it's not the territory. But then there's a way in which the very existence of the map changes the territory, and this is the tricky move. And it makes me think of Hegel, where, obviously, Žižek is famously an interpreter and thinker of Hegel with Lacan together, notably, is that for Hegel, our very map making changes the territory, which changes the map, which changes the territory, so on and so forth. That there is no hard split between the noumenon and the phenomenon, that the noumenon is for us, and that our very experience of things as phenomenon is, in a sense, invitational for our participation in what they are. So the map is part of the territory in not being the territory, and thus changes the territory relative to the map that we make. It is a, you could say, almost ontological feedback loop. And so the real, so it goes with reality and the real. The reality is part of the real, and in the way we participate in it, that changes how the real manifests, how we avoid the trauma of the real. And precisely because we're trying to avoid it, there is indeed construction. Something is built up, something is made. So another way to put it is that the map is part of the territory as it is not the territory. It makes me think, like Benita Roy will talk about, we always have, when we talk about nature or the cosmos, we have to remember that humans aren't in nature. We are nature, per se. So humans are a continual process of nature. That's important because if you start saying like, oh, humans, the universe doesn't think, humans do. Well, the problem with that is if you're not careful, you're suggesting that humans are not part of the universe. There are many thinkers who suggest that maybe humans are the way, consciousness is how the universe knows itself, etc., etc. We get into all that. But the main point is we have to consider the human as part of nature, not create this hard split. Well, likewise, so it goes with the map and the territory. The map is part of the territory. The territory arose to the map, and the territory is known by the map, and map making is part of the territory. There would be no maps if the territory did not consist of conditions of possibility for map making. So what can we say positively about the territory based on the very existence of maps? And what does it mean that we can map make, and what must the territory be? There are positive questions that arise from this, and even if the territory would be overly traumatic to experience fully, because it would be like again, that Borges story where the scroll, the map is unrolled and crushes the kingdom. We could say that, like if the real, lowercase r, encountered the Lacanian real, it would be the equivalent of a perfect map being unrolled that crushes the kingdom, like that Borges story where the map isn't the territory. And so I think that's called like scientific exactitude or something like that. And so that's the trauma. That the very, like if you have a map, there's a real sense in which you naturally are toward trying to make it perfect, and yet if you succeeded, it would destroy you. So all of this for Žižek is really important to think if we're going to think the issue of ideology and how ideologies work, because ideologies, we could say, are means of dealing with the real, of creating maps. And this is where things like desire and drive and all of the psychoanalysis comes in, because if we have to make maps that aren't the territory, which nevertheless try to be the territory, and yet if they succeeded would destroy them, and that very map making is part of the territory, which is, very hard to think. But I think if we look at Korbowski, Leibniz situation, Owen Barfield, we can start to get a sense of it. Well, then ideology is all simply a reflection of that process we just described. There's this line, ideology not only constructs a certain image of fulfillment, for example, it also endeavors to regulate a certain distance from it. But if we know that, will the mechanism still work? And this is a hanging question that you could say the sociologists like Philip Reeve and Berger are all wondering. So ideology emerges from this strange ontological Mobius loop situation, map isn't the territory situation, that then to make us function creates desires and fulfillment, which again, just like if the map equals the territory would destroyed, if we actually could get the desire, the object of our desire, the desire is destroyed. So we have to move to drive, as Cadell will stress, which, integrates with lack and accepts the fact that the map isn't the territory and yet still finds drive in that incompleteness. That AB, as we talk about in belonging again. And so likewise, you see that ideology creates distance from fulfillment for its functioning, and yet critically, Žižek is kind of suggesting there is something about ideology that is inevitable, that there's always going to be some sort of part of us that is ideological. Now he has nuanced views of that, but if that is the case, what are we going to do if we know that ideology, it kind of works this way, or if maps are not the territory? Can they still function? Are they all going to fall apart? I think we can associate this with the death of God and the loss of givens and all of that. So everything that Žižek is describing here, the entire topic of maps has a relationship with the topic of givens. And I think maps become all the stronger, actually, to fill in the power vacuum or the social vacuum when givens fail. They kind of rush in to fill that problem. I don't think it's by chance we're in such an ideological age, because ideology as functioning like a map, and maps like a given, or you could say that a map is a given you realize is a given, especially once you're conscious of it, and yet since it's not the territory, you can identify with that incompleteness, as we talked about earlier in the map is indestructible, and actually make that acceptable, because Gödel gives you a kind of way to justify the incompleteness of your map, because nothing is complete, so then it's okay, right? So it's kind of like that's what we've fallen back on. We've kind of fallen back on Gödel to deal with the sociological problem of there not being givens, because then we say, well, it's okay because all maps are incomplete. But then we're going to get the problem of internally consistent systems. There's this ultimate fragmentation that occurs that we have to deal with. Now, in this sense, we can almost say that maps relative to givens are the shadow of Buddha in Nietzsche. If the loss of givens is the death of God, then maps is a kind of shadow of Buddha that is a kind of residue, the kind of leftover of the death of God that hasn't gone away yet. But that mechanism, that shadow of Buddha, is creating all these conspiracies and tribalism and internally consistent, ever pluralization of internally consistent systems. And so that's reaching a saturation point that's forcing us to, on the liminal web and elsewhere, think new conditions of possibility, because there's a realization that maps that acknowledge that justify themselves according to their essential incompleteness is inadequate and leads to unintentional consequences. Žižek tells us that the ideological trick, therefore, so this is on the idea of like maps as ideology, the ideological trick, therefore, is to keep the object at a certain distance in order to sustain the satisfaction derived from the fantasy. If only I had X, I could fulfill my dream, so on and so forth. Ideology regulates this phantasmic distance in order to, as it were, avoid the real in the impossible. So this kind of intentional self-sabotage, this kind of gives us explanations where self-destruction, self-sabotage, all these things come from, because they're mechanisms of keeping the imaginary and the symbolic alive so that we can avoid the real, while also generating desire so that we don't want to change things. So, if you never obtain the object of your desires, then if the system fails to give you the objects of your desires, there's a way in which that's great, because then the system is justified, and you can never, if you got the object and it failed you, then you could say, well, the system set me up. But if you never got the object and you maintain desire in it, it could help you avoid the real while also continuing to give you drive. And so this is where this interesting paradoxical relationship between the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary gives us society and gives us our own ability to function socially. And, there's this other interesting line that Žižek describes where he says, the real is thus simultaneously the thing to which direct access is not possible and the obstacle that prevents this direct access, the thing that eludes our grasp and the distorting screen that makes us miss the thing. So it is both of those things. The real is what creates obstacles to keep us from accessing it, and simultaneously the thing we cannot access without trauma. Now, there's also this interesting notion where we actually can experience the real in a sense. Žižek stresses this, but we can't experience it without trauma or fully, right? Like the whole problem is that the real can in fact invade our symbolic and imaginary frames. The problem is that the map can fail and unveil territory. It's just that the reality, the symbolic, cannot fully integrate with the real without destroying itself. Likewise, the territory can't equal the map without destroying itself. So, that's the issue. But the very fact that it's possible for the map to be punctured, per se, is why we have a tension. And it should be noted, too, that when we talk about childhood, integrating with lack, and all of that, O.G. Rose belonging again, this is all to say that you accept what Žižek is telling you. You accept that the map isn't the territory, and you learn to move to drive in light of this, that you don't, say, fall into the trickery or, fall into the mechanisms of desire, but you learn to integrate into something like drive. I'll talk about intrinsic motivation that has gone through the crucible of, extrinsic motivation and training, but is able to be a motivation that is driven, not merely operating through mechanisms of self-deception, irony, distancing, and all these different things. Because what Žižek is describing is various psychological, you could say, gymnastics that we carry out to keep desire alive, as opposed to moving to drive. Why do we do that as human beings? Well, we may not know there's an option to move to drive. We also might be afraid to face the real difficulty, and drive is hard. So it can sometimes seem easier to just engage in these these endless gymnastics of keeping a certain distance from the real in our ideology, so that desire works, and we want to just keep desire working to organize our lives, especially if we don't know about drive, and especially if we're scared to face the real, so we can begin to move toward drive. So, but basically, with the death of God, the death of a paradigm, that, psychoanalytically can be taken to say that desire doesn't work, that the social paradigm of desire ultimately will fail, but we've kind of managed to keep the shadow of Buddha going by moving from givens to maps, moving from givens to ideology. Now, of course, there is something ideological about social givens. There is something ideological about them, but there's also something distinct. Now, ideologies are not given, so that kind of ideological structuring that's always present in givens is coming to the forefront, but the ideologies are not given. So what we do is we say, well, they're essentially incomplete, but they're essentially incomplete. So the very fact that they're not given, well, nothing is given. So they're practically just as given as anything else. And that functions as authority to keep that functions as legitimacy to us, enough to keep desire going. And that's why this issue of Gödel and the map is indestructible is such an issue, is because Gödel does not tell us that maps are false. He simply tells us that there's no formal system and that we're always dealing with maps. Well, then the fact that givens collapse and we find out we're dealing with maps doesn't automatically function to mean that maps go away. In fact, we just come to accept the incompleteness and actually can be more atomized, more individuated. And then what we're individuated into can be, quote unquote, indestructible. So, we're not, the shadow of Buddha in a way can be worse than, quote unquote, the big other God in a negative sense, and that's what we're dealing with, and so what we have to do is somehow move to drive, intrinsic motivation, childhood, as Nietzsche will say, which is very difficult, and this is where, Žižek says, Rex Butler in another book, Live Theory, I believe, on Žižek, says all significant philosophical systems introduce a certain gap or void into what is, a gap or void that we would call the subject. So we need to identify with being the gap, as opposed to simply saying the gap, is the fact that my beliefs I can't be certain of my beliefs. There's a way in which we've projected incompleteness onto the lack of certainty, but we don't see ourselves as the source or the Gödel point that's creating that lack of certainty to reflect what that means about us and who we are. And actually, I would ultimately argue that lack is precisely the condition that makes drive possible. And if we see ourselves as lacking, then we could move to driven subjects, but we have to own the lack versus project it from us into something like the lack of certainty or something. Now, a way that we might think of how to deal with this problem of finding some sort of balance, if you will, between reality and the real, the map and the territory, I think gets us to the topic of encounters. We'll talk in O.G. Rose about encounterology, surprise, the limit that Alex Ebert talks about. I definitely think that comes up as very important if we take all of this thinking seriously. And the question becomes, can we handle the surprise? Can we handle running into something? And I think that definitely kind of appears as being really, really important. And I also do like this, as Daly writes about Žižek's work. I like this quote here. This intangible real could be said to function like the vanishing point, something that cannot be represented, but which is nonetheless constitutive of representations. In quantum physics, by contrast, the real would be the curvature space, something that cannot be dimensionally determined, but which creates the conditions of possibility for dimensionality as such. And again, I think that just nicely kind of captures this relationship between the map and the territory. Žižek tells us the real resists full symbolization, but it is at the same time an excess generated by the process of symbolization itself. Without symbolization, there is no real, there is just flat stupidity of what is there. And I like that too, because again, it's kind of like saying the territory makes the map, and in making the map, it is the map functions as a kind of excess of the territory that cannot fully symbolize or represent that which it came from, that which emerged to it, because again, map making is part of the territory. Is that. And then, Žižek kind of points out that at the moment of the real, there's a sense in which that's when the map kind of fails, and the only thing remaining is the abyss of subjectivity, which then, of course, suggests the genius of Hegel to focus on the possibility of a science of subject, a subjective science, and what that would mean. And I think basically Korbowski is saying the same thing in a different way. Now, this all being the case, and we're going to talk in the paper as well about the parallax view, which I think is a great book, and how ultimately the parallax view, what all of this suggests to us is the need to make a choice of how we're going to view reality. Are we going to see it AA or AB? Well, if we see it AA, we're going to be insane. If we see it AB, there's the possibility of coming into sanity, but it is very difficult because you're flirting with the distinction between the map and the territory, reality and the real, and if you mess up, you might be overly exposed to the real, overwhelmed, and destroyed. If you approach Beatrice, you might smile too much and you'd be reduced to ash. So this is a dangerous undertaking. But if we don't take this risk, well, then we're going to suffer the insanity. And I would say the parallax view, a way to think about it, when you hold up your finger and you close one eye, your finger moves, right? And you kind of switch back and forth. Well, the finger doesn't literally move. It's just that by closing one eye, then closing the other, opening the other, back and forth, you create a certain movement of the background that then creates the effect of the finger moving. A way to think about the absolute choice, the move between AA and AB, is a kind of parallax view. You're not really, nothing in reality, nothing in your world is changing, and yet it is. The background against which it all stands out from changes. The schema by which you understand reality changes. And I will talk about also the absolute choice as being ultimately what Hegel presents us with, and what we could think about the parallax view as, and also what is needed to move from understanding to reason, AA to AB. It's the choice that arises precisely when we realize the map isn't the territory, And I think, another choice is to overly identify with the map not being the territory as an essential feature to maintain our map as a kind of shadow of Buddha after the death of God. So the absolute choice, another way to think about it that I brought up in the Phenomenology of Spirit conference and anthology at Philosophy Portal, is the Burdian donkey example, where you have two equally sized piles of grain, and the donkey starves because it can't make a rational choice on what to eat, right? Well, in that situation, in order for the donkey to eat, stuck between two equally sized piles of grain, it has to make what I call a non-rational choice, not an irrational choice, but a non-rational. It has to choose to do something even if it doesn't have a rational basis for it. Well, there's a real sense in which the movement from AA to AB is non-rational. There's nothing in reality that says to you, there's only situation, no things, that everything is process. It's like a rainbow in Barfield. Reality doesn't disclose that to you. And you could rationally function just as, you could rationally function believing AA versus AB. So how do you make the choice? Sure, you can say, well, it's because AA makes you insane. It has bad practical consequence. But if you believe in AA, you might say, well, that's just how it goes. And you could always arrange the evidence to say that there's no way to avoid it, or this is just how the dice roll in reality, right? Insanity in AA doesn't force you to acknowledge AB. It doesn't force you to change symbolic. That all being the case, I do think ultimately the move from AA to AB is a parallax view. It is an absolute choice. It ultimately, another way to put it, in Hegel, essence appears. What is essential appears. It is not that appearance keeps us from essence, but the essence of things is what comes forth in appearance. Maybe not totally, because the map isn't the territory, but appearance says something, suggests something, points to the essence of the thing appearing. Well, when I look at this bookcase, it doesn't force me to view appearance as an expression of essence. I could, choose to interpret the appearance of the bookcase as separate from and keeping me from essence, right? I have to make that choice. And it's the absolute choice because it chooses what I believe is the character of the absolute. It's to choose what I think is the character of the territory. And so we are ultimately faced with a kind of choice. And I think this choice brings us ultimately to Thomas Pynchon, who wrote Gravity's Rainbow, The Crying of Lot 49. And I think Harold Bloom has a tremendous collection of essays, critical essays on Gravity's Rainbow, on Pynchon, that I would suggest. He talks about Byron the Bulb, which I do think is a wonderful Kabbalistic parable suggesting our modern world. A way to think about Pynchon is, in his novels, everything is connected. Well, everything being connected is both a phrase of love and a phrase of madness. The very condition of connection is a relationship, but it's also paranoia. And I think Pynchon is full to the brim between this kind of choice. He'll talk about the ones and zeros in Gravity's Rainbow. Is it all add up to a 1 or does it add up to a 0? Which is playing on computer coding 1 zeros. And he describes often Odyphia, which plays on Sophocles, seeing the word Odysseus, where it gouges out his eyes at the end. It's playing on that in Pynchon from Sophocles. And it's the idea that when Odysseus starts to see this kind of conspiracy form, the question is it real or is it not? 1, 0. And the town she's in is described as a information circuitry, because what Mr. Pynchon understood is that as telecommunication advances, computers, networks, phones, all of this, we kind of create a society that is more and more positioned almost like a Kabbalistic, like a Jewish mysticism, where we can know everything. We have the capacity to know everything. But in knowing everything, that doesn't guarantee our eyes to be able to see everything as connected in the right way, or to see real connections, or to even be able to tell false connection from real connection, right? Everything ends up connected through telecommunication. But is that a connection of madness or a connection of intimacy? We have to make the choice. And it's like the absolute choice. It's like a parallax choice. And over again, you have different characters faced with having to make the absolute choice. 1, 0, love, Lovecraft, love, madness, and how they relate and experience that choice, how they develop under the weight of that choice, what happens to them psychologically. And I do think today there is increasingly, because of the internet, because of telecommunications, information, we find ourselves feeling like everything is connected, and then we have a meaning crisis. Often there, just because perhaps we successfully argue that relations are real, that metaphysical schemas that emphasize relation are best over things, well, that might just position us for madness, because, put us in a Thomas Pynchon novel, or intimacy. Well, what's the difference? Well, the difference probably, going back to Korbowski and Hegel, involves us having a proper symbolic by which to experience everything as connected in a manner we can handle versus be destroyed by. And Korbowski tells us with the wrong symbolic, A is A, faced with a world where everything is connected, will be destroyed. With AB, it might generate a rainbow, but that's why this new symbolic is so important. And basically, ideology, maps, which fill in the loss of givens, is not adequate to move us toward love versus madness, we might say. It's going to be trying to create islands that are isolated from everything, while the larger context is more and more one where everything is connected. So that's just kind of a recipe for pathology, right? Like, rather than isolate for various maps, we need to, we're going to have some kind of maps, But there are some maps that are more open than others, some maps that try to actually be movement and change and demanding that we integrate with the real, or integrate with lack best we can, however imperfectly, like Nietzschean children, Deleuzian individuals, absolute knowers, and so on and so forth, communities of absolute knowing, we might say, as we talk about with Cadell, versus maps that just say, that are more isolationist. The more isolationist people are in their maps, the more and more in our telecommunication system, we're in a pitching novel where everything is connected, the more and more that will generate madness and lead to all sorts of problems. So maps present us with a certain temptation to isolate ourselves in a context where everything is connected, and yet we cannot avoid maps, and maps are indestructible. And if the world is in fact relational in situation, we have to deal with maps. We cannot escape them. So what do? Well, we need a map that's going to help us see everything as connected more as a matter of love versus madness. We need to pick our map well. We need to map make well. But how do you create maps without using a map that you're already in, right? That seems to be contradictory. That seems to be impossible. Well, this is where Hegel seems to be very important, where philosophers like Whitehead and Barfield and others, Nietzsche, I think, are quite important to help us think the ability to generate maps that we know are created, and yet they still have an authority over us, and we try to align these maps with processes of becoming, as opposed to isolationist. And I think that's also going to deal with making maps to face contradiction versus avoid contradiction. The paper will then talk about Emancipation After Hegel by Todd McGowan, which is a tremendous book. I highly suggest. I love the line, what Hegel calls spirit, Geist, is just the capacity of thought to apprehend contradiction rather than merely succumbing to it as the natural world does, which means humans can respond and address contradiction. Not that we do. Hegel is telling us to face contradiction. That contradiction drives the development of subjectivity. And basically, what we're seeing is this world where everything is connected, which one is kind of contradictory, because how can there be things if they're all connected and things are just relations? There's a certain contradiction in that. And also we have to think everything is connected when we can't even think everything. We have to face the incomprehensible and try to comprehend it. Well, this is what Hegel also wants to encourage us. He wants to encourage us to see that as the development of Geist, the development of spirit, and that there's a certain power that can come from this. If we map make to avoid contradiction, that's going to lead to pathology. But if instead we map make to be better at contradiction and to face contradiction and to learn how to work through it, well, this is probably where this is the kind of life and the kind of symbolic A equals B, AB, this dialectical, this is the kind of symbolic that can make a world where everything is connected, one of love and community and possibility versus madness and hopelessness and nihilism. If everything is connected but we as human beings can't know everything, then nothing matters, right? So this is where the kind of nihilism can set in. So I think McGowan's understanding of Hegel can help us deal with a Pitchian world, as can Žižek, as can Kurt Gödel in the right way, Korbowski, Leibniz, and others. And yes, ultimately, the map is indestructible because love madness, the choice between love and madness is inescapable. But love madness, we dwelt with faithfully, could be trained through negation, sublation, into an empowerment and even beauty, bringing to mind the work of Thomas Jockin. And the fate of beauty is ultimately the fate of us, suggesting another book by O.G. Rose. And so we have a choice to make, and then a commitment that we need to give over to that choice that will determine the kind of world that may arise, that we can reconcile ourselves with if we only make that absolute choice today. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. Please, any purchases of the books is greatly appreciated. Any reviews is greatly appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.